Druids just got another really strange hero talent tree, but unlike the last one, I think this Elune's Chosen spec might actually wind up being good. Hi, it's Llarold, and I'm going to cover the new Elune's Chosen hero spec for Guardian and Balanced Druids, but before I do, if you like this video, please like it, and if you subscribe also, thank you. Before we get started, I really like Bear and Balanced Druid. I never ever play Balance in any sort of competitive content anymore, but I have actually played it since vanilla. Yes, vanilla. I did Zul'Guraba's Balance a few times with friends as a joke. I really like Balanced Druid a lot. The simplicity is super appealing, and it has a fun gameplay loop. And I feel the same way about Bear. The current style of play is fun, but the playstyle that this tree promotes could be a really fun change of pace, and it might actually be something I wind up enjoying more. Maybe. Okay, let's take a look at this tree. At the top of the tree, we have this passive talent, Boundless Moonlight. For balance, it makes your full moon call down 2 minor moons that deal astral damage and generate 3 astral power. 3 astral power on top of full moon, which generates 50 astral power? Not a ton. Guardian makes it so that Lunar Beam now causes you to leech life equal to 10% of all damage dealt to enemies within the beam. 10% leech is not really all that much, especially considering it only applies to enemies within the beam, which usually will be all enemies that you're fighting at the time that you have the beam up, but only 10% leech, that's not that great. Like, just to even jump into this before we even get into the tree, looking at the current talent setup, this is basically the bottom of the tree for Bear Druid. This is what you're kind of locked into. It's pretty hard to sacrifice any of these talents to take Lunar Beam, but obviously you have to. This tree is built around Lunar Beam, so what do you give up? The pretty steady supply of Rage from Blood Frenzy? Do you give up Raise? Do you give up the incredible defensive value of Ursoc's Fury? Do you give up Rage of the Sleeper? All of these are great talents. I think Rage of the Sleeper is the only real option. Ursoc's Guidance gives tons of cooldown reduction on Incarnation Guardian of Ursoc, so you either lose a major offensive cooldown or you lose a massive amount of cooldown reduction on a major offensive cooldown. It's one of those two, or a major rotational skill, or a massive amount of Rage that keeps the Incarnation Guardian of Ursoc cooldown reduction coming. It's got to be one of those. Maybe it's this massive amount of self-shielding. It's hard to lose any of this, and that really is the problem here with Bear Druid. There are so many great talents down here at the bottom, like not even including things like Elune's Favored or Moonless Night, which can add tons of healing, tons of damage. Flashing Claws, which can add tons of damage. There's lots of great talents here in the bottom of the tree that you would love to have, and you got to give up something to get Lunar Beam, which at the current tuning basically does no damage, less than a Moonfire, and does about half of a Frenzied Regen's worth of healing. Technically less than a Frenzied Regen's worth of, half of a Frenzied Regen's worth of healing on a 1-minute cooldown. This could all work, but Lunar Beam would need a massive damage buff for it to really be an appealing option at the current state of affairs. Now let's continue with that first talent. Fury of Elune now ends with a flash of energy blasting nearby enemies for astral damage. So for Balanced Druid, Full Moon and Fury of Elune are a choice node. You can take one or the other. For Bear Druid, Fury of Elune is not an available talent at all. Now maybe there's something going on where Blizzard's going to make it so that you can pick up Fury of Elune, or I mean, maybe it could be a choice node with Lunar Beam. That might be interesting. If it were a more damage-oriented talent available there, that would be pretty good. The mastery that you get from Lunar Beam is appealing. A 15% mastery bonus for 8 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. That's not very good, but it is an interesting concept. A offensive cooldown or a big stat bonus to layer in with some offensive cooldowns. Cool concept, I guess. The problem is that ultimately you're not getting Fury of Elune and Full Moon at the same time as Balance. You're not getting Fury of Elune at all as Bear, so this is a bit of a weird start. All right, now let's move over to Moon Guardian. Moon Guardian makes it so that for Balanced Druid, Moonfire and Starfire generate an additional 2 astral power. On the whole, this is maybe 10% more astral power total. That's actually pretty good. It's your main active resource, and getting more of it is pretty good. I think you get 10 astral power in the current standard talent setup when you cast Starfire, so getting 12 instead, that's pretty good. As Bear Druid, it makes it so that your free automatic Moonfires from Galactic Guardian generate 5 Rage. Previously, they had generated a full 8 rage, and that was then removed entirely, so they would generate 0 rage. Now this would bring them up to 5 rage. It's sort of a halfway compromise between where Bear Druid was at the start of Shadowlands, at the start of Dragonflight, and where they are right now in Dragonflight, the dumpster. So, you know, better than the dumpster, but not exactly amazing either. Lunar Insight makes Moonfire deal 10% more damage. Moonfire is a pretty large source of your damage, so that's a pretty good damage bonus. Not bad. Glistening Fur, very basic. 6% less arcane damage, 3% less magic damage taken. Good. You know, less magic damage taken is especially good for Bear Druids. They are really, really tanky against physical damage, and they do actually tend to struggle against magic damage more than other tanks. So this is a really good defensive bonus. Really basic passive damage bonus, really basic passive defensive bonus, pretty good. And getting a bunch of free extra rage from your Galactic Guardian Moonfire procs is pretty good. This whole line of talents is great. Lunar Amplification. Each non-arcane damaging ability you use increases the damage of your next arcane damaging ability by 3%, stacking up to 3 times. This is good for both talents, both specs. You have about half of your abilities as balance are going to deal either nature or astral damage, which is not arcane damage, so that's going to boost all of your arcane damage skills. As Bear, most of your skills are not arcane damage. Mangle, Thrash, Swipe, Raise, Maul, all of that's not arcane damage, so that's all going to boost Moonfire, and that's pretty appealing. Getting more damage on all of your Moonfires is pretty good. Now, it's not clear whether, and sometimes there are these kind of weird interactions here where by using Thrash or whatever and proccing Galactic Guardian, maybe it would consume that, or maybe it would just simply, that damage bonus would apply to the Galactic Guardian without actually consuming it. No way to really know until you can test, but certainly something that we're going to be looking out for when we get in there testing. But, you know, all pretty cool. Atmospheric Exposure makes it so that enemies damage by Full Moon, Fury of Elune, or Lunar Beam take 4% increased damage from you for 6 seconds. This is a really undertuned number. The idea of your main cooldown getting, you know, a small amount more damage bonus resource generation for Full Moon, a bit of extra damage for Fury of Elune, a very weak leech bonus for Lunar Beam, like getting more juice into those abilities, a cool concept, making them turn into bigger damage taken increases on enemies as part of sort of a burst window, basically. I think that's cool. The numbers are just wrong. This probably would need to be like 10% more damage for 10 seconds for it to feel okay. As it currently is tuned, this is pretty low. Now, Full Moon, all of the moon spells for balance are 20-second cooldowns, so this is a little bit more acceptable, but Lunar Beam is a 1-minute cooldown, so 4% more damage for 6 seconds is way too low. Moondust. Enemies affected by Moonfire are slowed by 30%. Awesome. This is something the Bear Druids have always struggled with. They used to have easy access to infected wounds. I think all the way back in Legion, that was just sort of like a baseline thing. I think it was part of your artifact weapon tree, and it was pretty great to be able to slow enemies all the time. And then that was moved into either like being a hard to access talent, or now it's a pretty expensive talent. It's not something you're going to want to spend a talent point on, but it is really nice to have some sort of consistent move speed slow, and lacking that is definitely a weakness for Bear Druids. So having that as something that you can passively spec into very easy, slow on all enemies is really appealing. By comparison, Elune's Grace, 3 seconds shorter cooldown on Wild Charge in Bear form or Moonkin form, so 12-second cooldown on Wild Charge as a Bear. Not exactly a huge deal. Could be useful in some situations where you really need to charge multiple times in the span of under 15 seconds, but over 12 seconds, but hard to imagine a lot of scenarios where that's really going to be the case. So I think Moondust would probably be the go-to most of the time, unless you're in a situation where slowing enemies isn't going to do anything. Stellar Command makes it so that Full Moon and Fury or Elune do 15% more damage, and Lunar Beam deals 30% more damage. Now, the problem with this is good for Balance Druid. Full Moon and Fury or Elune, as they've written it here, doing more damage, great. Lunar Beam doing 30% more damage, 30% of nothing is still nothing, and therein lies really the fundamental problem with this for Bear Druids. If they were to buff Lunar Beam by 300% between now and the War Within, then basically all of the crimes of this talent tree are forgiven. Like Lunar Beam, not exactly the prettiest skill. I used to love it. There was once upon a time where I really did think it was like a cool skill. I liked it. I liked it as a talent. I like the concept, and I want this all to succeed. It just needs to have a significant damage increase and probably a better new visual, if I'm being honest. The alternative here is Lunar Calling. Starfire deals 40% increased damage to its primary target, but no longer triggers Solar Eclipse. Now, the current accepted way to DPS as a balanced druid is to mainly stick in Solar Eclipse and be spamming Wraths. So this represents a pretty significant change of playstyle, but it does mean 40% more damage for Starfire on the primary target. So if you were to use this in single target, which I don't really know enough about balanced druid to say for sure that you would use this over the Keeper of the Grove talent tree, but given how wonky that talent tree is, that one sort of seemed dead on arrival, and this one seems a lot more appealing for balance. I think this could wind up actually just changing the way that you play in single target as a balanced druid. Now, it's also possible you ignore Lunar Calling and you just play the Stellar Command setup for even more burst damage with your full moons. I think that's probably the approach, and that is pretty appealing. For Bear Druids, I think this talent is substantially more appealing than Stellar Command. You get Thrash to deal arcane damage, so you're not dealing with armor with Thrash anymore. It's benefiting from all of the talents that interact with your magic damage, and let's take a look at some of those now. Elune's Favored, you deal 10% increased arcane damage and heal for 40% of all the arcane damage you deal. That basically makes Ursoc's Fury not irrelevant, but really close. I mean, you could hypothetically, you could deal with dropping Rays and Ursoc's Fury. You could take Elune's Favored and potentially run like Flashing Claws. There's some very weird talent ideas in here. I don't ever really want to give up Rays. It's hard to justify. Maybe Rays gets moved up in the tree. You know, if Rays got moved up into the Vulnerable Flesh or Tooth and Claw range, and you weren't having to give up such an incredibly valuable talent to be able to pick up things like Flashing Claws and Elune's Favored, I think this would be a lot more favorable of a talent setup, of a hero talent spec as well, than it is right now. But certainly this ability to take some things like Flashing Claws, get a lot more damage on Thrash, getting multiple Thrash procs, potentially getting a massive amount of healing delta to yourself based on all the arcane damage that you're dealing. Very, very interesting concept. A lot of really, really cool talent overlaps that I think could make sense. And I love this idea of turning Bear into sort of a semi-caster tank. I do think that's really fun and cool. And Lunar Calling, turning Thrash into arcane damage, is such a great step in that direction. Now we have the talent choice node, the Light of Elune, and Astral Insight. Light of Elune makes it so that Moonfire damage has a chance to call down a Fury of Elune to follow your target, and that generates Astral Power or Rage over its duration. I think this is the choice. I think this is the talent of choice. Maybe not for Balanced Druid. Getting Astral Insight, getting the 10% increased arcane damage from spells and abilities while your Chosen of Elune is active, that may be better for your damage windows, your burst damage windows, and those Chosen of Elune procs that you get. But for Bear Druid, I think it's pretty clear to me. Getting the Fury of Elune procs, depending on the proc chance, you know, if it's low enough, then this wouldn't be the talent. But I do think this is the talent of choice, especially with all of the other synergy that we have in the tree. We have Fury of Elune ending with a flash of energy, blasting enemies for nearby for astral damage. Getting this atmospheric exposure proc to give you more damage on all the enemies that Fury of Elune procs on. Getting potentially getting more Fury of Elune damage out of Lunar Amplification or out of potentially Stellar Command, although I think with the current tuning of Lunar Beam, I don't think you would take Stellar Command, but it's possible that they tune it up, and then now this becomes an amazing burst talent, and then you're getting even more damage out of Fury of Elune from Stellar Command. Great. Excellent. Arcane Affinity just makes it so you do 3% more arcane damage. Pretty boring. Lunation makes it so that your arcane abilities reduce the cooldown of Fury of Elune and New Moon, Half Moon, and Full Moon by a second. That is really appealing for Balanced Druid. Getting a lot of cooldown reduction on New Moon, Half Moon, Full Moon. That's really good, and it does synergize pretty nicely with Lunar Calling, which is a bit weird, but to be in Lunar Eclipse all the time, even in single target, just spamming out Starfires and getting a lot of cooldown reduction on your moon skills is pretty interesting. Additionally, getting your arcane abilities to reduce the cooldown of Lunar Beam, especially if this interacts with Lunar Calling turning Thrash into an arcane damage skill, if that is able to proc off of Flashing Claws, like let's say Raze gets moved, you're not worried about it. Or let's say Flashing Claws gets turned into a 1-point skill or something. You're taking Flashing Claws, you're getting multiple Thrashes proccing. All of those are counting toward reducing the cooldown of Lunar Beam. I think most of Lunar Beam's undertuning concerns can be forgiven at that point. If you're getting Lunar Beam on a 25-second cooldown or a 30-second cooldown as opposed to a minute cooldown, or even less, if all of the Galactic Guardian procs count, if consuming them with Twin Moon counts as 2 abilities, I find that hard to believe. But let's say Galactic Guardian procs do count. Let's say that Thrash procs from Flashing Claws count. You could potentially get 50% cooldown reduction on Lunar Beam. That is pretty appealing, and it could actually make Lunar Beam into an interesting skill, which is insane to think considering how bad it has been all of this expansion, and really for just about as long as I can remember now. But that is pretty interesting. I mean, cooldown reduction, what a concept. I just said this in another video, but truly, like, it is the most interesting mechanic in all of WoW's class design, and you always love to see it, and this is no exception. It's really cool. And finally, we capstone here with the Eternal Moon, which just increases all of the bonuses that we got out of that top tree. Your full moon, your extra minor moons that were attacked onto full moon are now also thrown into new moon and half moon. You get a bonus damage, you get a bit of bonus astral power. Hard to complain about. For Guardian, Lunar Beam increases your mastery from 15% up to 23%. It does another 30% more damage, and it lasts another 3 seconds. Okay, now instead of lasting for 8 seconds, it's 11. If you're able to get that cooldown reduction, I mean, if you're able to get it into the 30-second range, okay, you're getting like a third uptime on Lunar Beam. That's actually kind of appealing then. Shocking to say, but like they really managed to pull it all together at the very end in a way that is kind of cool sounding. And then finally, the flash of energy from the explosion of Fury of Elune now grants you rage or astral power and does more damage. This really makes it so that the Light of Elune, I think, becomes a must-have talent here, unless the proc rate is just impossibly low. But I just don't see how you could not take this talent as either spec, really. You want to get that added value onto the Eternal Moon and onto Boundless Moonlight. All those free extra damage procs just sound really, really appealing. The free damage increase procs from Atmospheric Exposure seem super cool. I am surprised to say that I am interested in playing a Lunar Beam setup, but I am very interested in making it work. I want this to be good and cool and to work, because I do love the idea of Bear Druid as a caster. Spamming out tons of Moonfires, you know, it's always something I've really enjoyed about Bear Druid, the ability to tag enemies from range. It's one of the like things that really sets it apart from the rest of the tank classes, this ability to deal a lot of magic damage. And being able to do so passively just through like Thrash procs and Galactic Guardian and Twin Moonfire is really cool. Being able to heal based off of that with Elune's Favored is extremely fun and compelling. And I'm really, really excited about the possibility of this actually being something that's good. And I just really can't wait to play around with it in the War Within. It's just such an appealing, very different, truly, truly different, but pretty cool. All right, I think that covers it. Thanks for watching. Bye.